definition for feudalism. Now, this is not to be confused with what they sometimes refer to as seigneurialism or manorialism. That's more the economic concept where we talk about like kind of the use of serfs and peasants and kind of other laborers and stuff like that. This is the more kind of social, kind of military political structure at the kind of top end of the social pyramid that we have in kind of European society at the time. All right, and so this was kind of developed as kind of a concept during the time of the Carolingian Empire, during the time of Charlemagne, but became very kind of dominant during right after the Viking raids and stuff like that. All right, now what the deal is, while we have kind of Western Europe essentially kind of almost reunified under the Frankish kingdom, there's still some local kind of autonomy in those counties and kind of other states and stuff like that. So at the time, like kings didn't have like professional standing armies, like professional standing armies like what the United States has. All right. Instead, or like Rome had at one point. All right. Instead, what we find here is that the kings have to kind of generate a military through the fact that the main kind of source of their title and wealth comes from the ownership of land, and then divvying out that land to kind of get that kind of military kind of service. So at the top of the kind of main relationship, at the very top, that's kind of the backbone of feudalism, is this relationship between lord and vassal. All right. Simply, a lord is someone who grants land to another in the feudal system, and the vassal is the one who receives the land. Lord, the landlord, and that. So generally, his idea is that king is the ultimate kind of like lord of his realm, but sometimes isn't always the most powerful person. At times, you'll find vassals that are sometimes more powerful than lords. And it's not uncommon to have a person be a vassal and a lord. They could be a lord to a minor noble and a vassal to like a king and stuff like that. And so it's as time goes on, too, it gets a little confusing at times because we'll start to see a number of kind of feudal kind of states that emerge that will, they'll marry off sons and daughters, and we'll start to see a lot of incestuous kind of families that emerge in royalty. And so what you'll find is that usually a lot of this stuff is based on pomp and circumstance. A vassal, when they receive a land, they're expected to kind of generate a military for a lord. All right. Sometimes establish courts in that. The kind of big ceremony that kind of exemplifies that is this ceremony referred to as investiture. That's essentially kind of the symbolic act in which a lord prevents a vassal of a piece of land. That piece of land is referred to as a fief. However, the term feudalism comes from the French term for fief or fiefdom. And so these can be very elaborate in certain occasions, or they can be just a simple act in which basically the lord takes a big clump of dirt and just hands it over to the vassal. All right. But after that, the vassal is expected to kind of provide certain things for the lord when called upon. You do have the times you have sometimes vassals who are vassals to multiple lords, as they kind of compile kind of territory. That can get kind of tricky. Prime example in the investiture, where we see where lord and vassal, it isn't always clear cut who has the most power, is the establishment of Normandy. Last week I was talking about the Normans, the Vikings that basically inhabited northern France. Right? They were given that name because the French saw them coming from the north, so they called them Northmen. So in the 9th century, the French king, a guy named Charles the Simple, gave land, which became Normandy, to the Vikings. Right? There was a Viking king named Rollo. It was mainly just to pay them off. All right, it was like a bribe or something, basically to have them just stop raiding. Here, take some land, a good chunk of land, matter of fact. So they went through an investiture thing to try to kind of like integrate the Vikings into this feudal society. All right, so what ends up happening, according to historians, is that Charles the Simple, basically hands Rollo his clump of dirt there, and at the end, it was ceremonious for the vassal to kiss the lord's feet. All right, Rollo, according to historians, is like, F that, I'm not doing that. So apparently, he basically had 2 of his men pick up the king of France, basically hold him up in the air where his feet were basically at a face level, and he kissed his feet, sent the king down, and then they shoved him. And the king fell down and had to get up and wipe himself off. Didn't retaliate because he saw the bigger picture at hand. But if you look at that right there, you'd say, well, that guy got played, all right? However, it was a pretty smart move on Charles's kind of way because it did essentially kind of end those reigns, and eventually the Normans integrated into French society. So that's where the kind of Viking king became a vassal to the French king. All right, and it was a kind of a brilliant move, and so that's why he did retaliate, because he saw the bigger picture at hand. I'm gonna play this video here, probably a structure that seems to exemplify what feudalism is the castle. So this talks about how living in a castle is
Europe in the year 1200 was a tough and dangerous place. Society was strictly divided into social classes. The system was called feudalism, and it governed the relationships between a lord or landowner and his servants. Wealthy and powerful noblemen called lords fought each other for control of the land and the people who lived on it. A lord's strength depended on his ability to defend his land and his property. To do so, he needed two things: a castle and an army. The best sites for castles were high on a mountain or on the banks of a river or atop a rocky cliff. Attacking a castle built in one of these locations was difficult. There was usually only one direction from which you could approach a castle, and that side was carefully guarded. For extra insurance against attackers, a trench with water, called a moat, might surround the castle. Watchtowers manned by armed soldiers were built at intervals along the outside wall. The stone walls ranged from 12 to 20 feet thick. Inside these defenses were the courtyard, some smaller buildings, and the lord's castle, called a keep, because the noble and his family were kept there. Life inside the castle, even during peaceful times, was anything but luxurious. After all, defense and safety were the main considerations. Comfort took a back seat. The building itself was cold and drafty. An army of servants was needed to keep warm fires going 24 hours a day. There were only a few actual bedrooms. The lord, his family, and often his servants shared one bedroom. Toilets were built into the outer wall and might end in a ditch or the moat. The kitchens were just a group of sheds in the courtyard. Food was unlikely to arrive hot at the table after being carried through the open air and up the drafty staircases. The center of activity in the castle was the Great Hall, a large open room where family and guests gathered to conduct business or eat and relax. A chapel-worthy household could attend Mass, reflected the importance of the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages.
Oh, sorry about that. So while the castles are different, there are some similarities. Again, they're the home of the Lord, all right, and the kind of land around there, but also for security. In times of invasion, those in the countryside would seek refuge back there. So you have a well for maintaining water. You'd have drawbridge, stuff like that, kitchens, stuff like turrets for kind of protection, and then some of those turrets you would have in certain castles they call murder slits, which is basically kind of these angled areas where bowmen can kind of shoot arrows. Again, like if you're Europe, they have castles kind of dotted all over the place. This one's called Bottom Castle, which is in southern England, which is kind of like anytime they talk about like kind of a Disney type thing, they always kind of show that castle. It's a pretty elaborate kind of fortresses. This is Dover Castle in southern England that was built during the time of William the Conqueror, who I'll talk about tomorrow. Cities like Edinburgh developed around the castle. in Scotland there, and you see the kind of like the strategic location it is. That's one in Transylvania. This one you'll find like in Ireland and Scotland. Like this is around Loch Ness. We were there in 2004. You'll see like kind of castles. Like there's a couple castles there that are like kind of abandoned and kind of like parts falling apart, but people can kind of walk around them and stuff. To siege a castle, if you have to siege a castle, it could take months. There was a lot of kind of manpower and equipment that was necessary. Siege towers, trebuchets, battering rams, stuff like that. Also, too, I'm going to keep the going here. Like I said, military service is a key component here. Generally, what kind of vassals would kind of like generate for the lord is kind of bringing together an army. You would have what they call men-at-arms, which is basically foot soldiers, and then knights, who are on the lower tier of kind of like nobility. They're the ones like in England, they're classified as sirs and stuff like that. The thing about knights that separated them from men-at-arms is horseback. They had horses. All right, and so this is like in the DBQ, they were kind of comparing them to samurai to a certain extent. I'm going to show this video here at the end that kind of talks about like how we have this image of knights as being kind of knight in shining armor and stuff like that. In many cases, a lot of knights were at times can be somewhat almost like terrorizing populations. They could be used as almost like mafia goons to a certain extent. All right, so a lot of that image is kind of perpetuated thanks to Disney and stuff like that. So knights generally underneath, like kind of their armor, you would have chainmail, pretty heavy. This idea to basically kind of protect against kind of sword wounds and stuff. Very kind of small, very kind of intricately linked pieces of metal. The difference, like when the DBQ talking about samurai, is that their armor tended to be a little more leather. Here, knights wearing heavier armor was the way to kind of protect against sword wounds because back then, if you got a wound, it could be pretty serious. You get sepsis and stuff like that. Medical science was somewhat limited back then, so people could die from infection, like fevers and stuff like that from that. So it could protect against that. However, and you do have an advantage. Like I said, when Vikings, one of the reasons, like when the Viking race decided, is like when Vikings would raid areas and there was knights, there was people men on horseback, they were at a disadvantage. Unfortunately, if you get knocked off your horse, you're kind of like a turtle with its, like on its shell. All right, it's really kind of hard to kind of maneuver and kind of operate there. I had a student teacher in 2011. She used to live in Austria, and she sent me this picture. She right around the corner from her house, she said there was a museum that was all on medieval armor. And so this one was, I thought was kind of interesting. It was on a horse, which you wouldn't see this very often in battle. Horses were pretty expensive. They're expensive now, but I mean, they were pretty expensive back then. In many cases, it's like kind of like having a Bugatti or something. It did, to equip that with that armor was probably expensive, and also, like, see for an eyes, it's got to be kind of like hindering there. But you would find there's other ones that do kind of with kind of horse armor and such. There's some that are used for ceremonies, in courtly kind of settings and stuff like that, like these two here. If they were used in any type of kind of like battle situation, it would be kind of for a mock battle in the form of tournaments. Tournaments were these contests where knights could win prizes. Money, horses, stuff like that, in which they would kind of showcase their military skills. They would showcase for their lords and various lords, show off for noble women and stuff like that. Probably the most famous event that's associated with tournaments is jousting. You guys want to know what that is? That's kind of associated with that. And some of these tournaments were held in entire towns. They could go on for weeks on end. The idea was to try to have the knights hone their skills, and also a lot of these guys kind of testosterone build. It's a way to kind of get some of that out, But there was always opportunity for making money and kind of like, fighting and kind of like ransoming people and stuff like that. At the kind of crescendo at the end of a tournament situation, you would have what they call a melee, which is basically just knights just kind of showing off their skills. People did die in some certain cases, but that wasn't the kind of intention. If you will, you see like kind of women up there, kind of like the noble women that they're trying to impress. And so, like for knights, some are born into it, like any type of kind of social structure class thing. But there's others that, like particularly if they're sons of kind of like minor nobles or something like that could obtain this through kind of an apprentice program, if you will. The first step would be a page. That's usually at the age of 7 or 8. You would go live with the knight. You could be educated. You're kind of like a glorified errand boy. At the age of 14, you were given the title squire. There, you kind of maintain the armor of the knight. make sure the horses were fed and stuff like that. You were also taught like certain things when it came to courtly matters, like going in if you're in the presence of a lord, how you act, how you walk into a room, all that stuff. They're kind of protocols that are kind of associated with all the pomp and circumstances in there. And then at the age of 21, that's when you were knighted generally by your lord. And still to this, like England still does that, right? So you still have you have people like Sir Elton John, right, who are knighted, but they're not expected to engage in any military service. That's a honorific title now given to people for their kind of lifetime achievements, if you will. But that's a vestige that's still left over kind of from the age of feudalism, if you will. Now a lot of the ideas, like I said, that we get from like knights and stuff like that comes from this kind of ideal, which is this code of ethics. And I mentioned briefly when I was talking about Japanese samurai and Bushido called chivalry. Right. This was a code of ethics, the idea that knights were supposed to uphold. However, rarely did knights kind of uphold this. There was a lot of bad behavior by knights. Chivalry occurred in kind of 4 historical eras. One, like we talk about how, like one aspect of we talk about today is like when you open up a door for a lady and say chivalry's not dead or whatever like that. A lot of that comes from this concept that came back from the Middle East after the Crusades, in which kind of a lot of Norman knights noticed how certain Arab women in the Islamic faith were held to basically they were kind of kept away from others and stuff to maintain purity and stuff like that. So you see this concept of what they call courtly love, this idea of admiring women from afar, particularly of a certain class. But women who are a lower class were open for things like basically rape and murder. All right, it's been documented on that stuff. So some of this idea that we have, this ideal, wasn't always reached. All right, the term comes from the fact that the French term for horse was chevalier. A chevalier, cavalier was basically kind of a horseman and knight. So that's where chivalry comes from, if you will. All right, and also at the time, a lot of that stuff was propagated by what basically kind of like what we call troubadours. Who were poets that would travel around to various kind of royal courts and basically and today when we talk about troubadour, somebody who is essentially like a musician who tours and stuff like that. But they had these poems, they sing about the kind of knights and the noble ladies, like Eleanor of Aquitaine had quite a few and stuff like that. And so this kind of propagated this kind of myth that knights were always kind of doing the right thing and stuff like that, which again, it's kind of silly to expect everybody to be kind of perfect to a certain degree. All right, so I'm gonna stop the recording there. I'm gonna play this video from